The year was 1867, a time when the vast expanse of the American frontier promised new beginnings for those brave enough to venture westward. For those who dared to cross the endless prairie, dreams of prosperity could vanish in a heartbeat, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, who watched her entire world burn before her eyes, and the Dakota hunter who found her when all she had left was the will to survive. The blood on Sarah Mitchell's hands had dried to a deep crimson, flaking off as she clutched the hunting knife her father had given her before they left Missouri. 3 days had passed since the attack. 3 days later, she had hidden beneath their overturned wagon, pressing her fist against her mouth to muffle her screams as the sounds of death surrounded her. 3 days after the Westbrook wagon train, 18 settlers bound for Wyoming territory had been attacked in the pre-dawn stillness by men whose faces were concealed by cloth masks. Sarah had been gathering kindling when the first shots rang out. The thunderous crack of rifles shattered the quiet dawn, followed by screams that would haunt her for however long she had left to live. She had dropped instantly, her body responding before her mind could process what was happening. Years of hunting with her father had taught her to move silently, and now that skill kept her alive as she crawled through the dewy grass away from camp, but not far enough to avoid witnessing the slaughter. Now she was alone on the Nebraska plains, a place where the sky stretched endlessly in all directions, making her feel smaller with each passing hour. Her honey-blonde hair hung in dirty tangles around her face, once braided neatly, but now wild and matted. Her blue calico dress was torn, at the hem stained with dirt and blood, some hers, some not. The early October wind cut through her clothing like a knife. Winter came early to these territories, and Sarah knew that if starvation didn't claim her first, the cold surely would. She had taken what she could from the massacre site after the attackers left: a canteen half full of water, her father's hunting knife, a woolen blanket that had fallen from one of the wagons during the chaos, and a small pouch of cornmeal. Nothing else had been salvageable. The raiders had been thorough in their destruction. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from thirst and disuse. Just keep moving. But toward what? Sarah had no clear destination, only the vague understanding that she needed to find a settlement, a trading post, or any sign of civilization. The Westbrook wagon train had been following the North Platte River, aiming to reach Fort Laramie before winter set in. But in her panic and confusion after the attack, she'd lost track of the river. Each step was becoming more difficult than the last. Her boots, never meant for such a journey, had rubbed raw blisters on her heels that burst and bled anew with every step. The knife she carried offered little comfort against the vastness of the wilderness or the threats it contained. As twilight approached, Sarah sought shelter in a shallow ravine, gathering what dry grasses she could find to create some meager protection against the wind. She had no means to start a fire. The flint had been in her father's pack, and Thomas Mitchell's body lay back at the massacre site, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Thomas Mitchell had been a schoolteacher from Ohio, full of dreams and ideals. After Sarah's mother died of tuberculosis 2 years ago, he had convinced Sarah that a fresh start in Wyoming was what they both needed. The wagon train journey was supposed to be the beginning of their new life, not the end of everything she'd ever known. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the distant howl of wolves and the constant gnawing fear that kept her heart racing. When dawn broke, Sarah forced herself to her feet despite the protests of her aching body. The morning was grey, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that threatened rain. She allowed herself a small sip from the canteen, rationing what little water remained, before steeling her resolve. Her father had always said she had a stubborn streak wider than the Mississippi. It was time to prove him right. By midday, the clouds had opened, releasing a steady, cold rain that soaked through her clothing and chilled her to the bone. Sarah's pace slowed, her boots sliding in the mud, each step requiring more effort than she could afford to expend. Still, she pushed forward, following a gradual downward slope in hopes it would lead to water. It was during a brief respite from the rain that she spotted it, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the grey sky. Her heart leapt into her throat. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant either salvation or danger. Sarah hesitated, debating whether to approach or avoid the smoke. Who might be waiting there? Settlers, soldiers, the very men who had attacked her wagon train? Desperation won out over caution. She would die out here alone. That much was certain. Whatever waited at that fire couldn't be worse than freezing to death in this vast emptiness. She altered her course, heading toward the smoke with renewed purpose. The rain began again, harder now, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on that distant promise of life. What she didn't notice were the eyes watching her from a ridge, nearly half a mile away. A solitary figure tracked her movement through the rain-swept landscape. He had been following her trail for nearly a day, reading the story of her desperate flight in the bent grasses and dragging footprints she left behind. Daniel Swift River lowered his spyglass and frowned. The woman was heading straight for a camp of traders whose reputation for cruelty toward both natives and women was well known throughout the territory. She was walking from one death into another. He tucked the brass spyglass, a prized possession traded years ago for 6 prime beaver pelts, into the leather pouch at his side. Rain dripped from the brim of the wide-brimmed hat he wore, a concession to the weather rather than any desire to adopt white man's fashion. Daniel was Dakota of the Madewa Canton Band, though he had spent much of the past decade moving between worlds, hunting, trading, occasionally serving as guide for the army when it suited his purposes. He had been tracking a small herd of elk when he discovered the massacre site 2 days earlier. The brutality of the attack had told him immediately it wasn't the work of his people or any other tribe he knew. The bodies had been stripped of valuables, but left otherwise intact. No tribal warrior would waste such resources. This was the work of white men preying on their own kind, bandits using the convenient excuse of Indian attacks to cover their crimes. He had found her trail leading away from the site. Small footprints, uneven, clearly made by someone exhausted and frightened. Following her hadn't been a conscious decision, merely an extension of his curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Now, watching her stumble toward danger, Daniel knew he had a choice to make. Leave her to her fate. After all, she was not his responsibility, not his people, or intervene in ways that could bring him only trouble. The rain continued to fall, washing away any easy answers, leaving only the hard truth that the woman wouldn't survive another night alone on the plains. Daniel stood, adjusted the rifle slung across his back, and began to move. Whatever decision he had just made, even he wasn't entirely sure of his reasons, but as the distance between them closed, he knew that both their fates had just become entangled in ways neither could yet understand. Sarah's vision blurred as she pushed forward through the tall prairie grass. The distant smoke was her only beacon in the gathering dusk. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Her clothes clung to her skin, drawing precious warmth from her body. With every gust of wind, the small knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance, but she gripped it tighter as she approached what appeared to be a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixing with another scent that made her empty stomach clench: roasting meat. She paused at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of scrub oak. Through the branches, she could make out 3 wagons arranged in a rough semicircle. 6 men moved about the camp, rough-looking figures in buckskin and wool. A campfire blazed in the center, where something, perhaps a rabbit, turned on a crude spit. Sarah hesitated, doubt creeping in where desperation had led. There was something about these men that set off warnings in her mind. Their loud, coarse laughter carried to her hiding spot, along with fragments of conversation that made her skin crawl. "Good haul from them wagons. Should have kept one of them women, though. Next time we won't be so hasty." The blood in Sarah's veins turned to ice. These weren't potential saviors. These were the men who had murdered the Westbrook party, her father, everyone she had known. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound, when her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk, but not before dislodging a cascade of raindrops from the leaves above. One of the men turned toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp, with suspicion. "Show yourself!" Sarah froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The man started toward her hiding spot, joined by another who carried a rifle. She knew she should run, but her body refused to obey, trapped between fear and exhaustion. "Check it out, Mills," the second man ordered. "Probably just a deer, but no sense taking chances." The man called Mills drew his pistol and advanced toward the tree line where Sarah hid. In 20 more steps, he would discover her. In 30, she would be dead. Or worse. A sharp whistling sound cut through the air, followed by a dull thud. Mills stopped abruptly, looking down at his chest in confusion. The shaft of an arrow protruded from between his ribs, its fletching trembling. With the impact, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood emerged, spilling down his chin before he crumpled to the ground. Pandemonium erupted in the camp. The remaining men scattered for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting conflicting orders. Another arrow flew from somewhere to Sarah's left, missing its target, but sending the bandits into further disarray. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Indians!" one of them yelled. "Take cover!" Sarah remained motionless, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The bandits' attention was no longer on finding her, but on the new threat. She needed to move, to escape while they were distracted. But which way was safe? A strong hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. An arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward into the deeper shadows beyond the scrub oak. "Be still," a voice whispered in her ear, the English accented but clear. "Or we both die." Sarah's instinct was to struggle, to fight against this new captor, but the sound of gunfire from the camp made her reconsider. Whoever held her had just killed one of the men responsible for the massacre. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not an enemy. She allowed herself to be pulled deeper into the woods, moving in a low crouch behind her mysterious rescuer. Only when they were several hundred yards from the camp did he release his hold on her. Sarah spun around, knife raised defensively, and got her first clear look at the man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat that seemed oddly out of place with his otherwise traditional appearance. A bow was slung across his back alongside a rifle of European make, but it was his eyes that held her attention. Dark, intelligent, and currently regarding her with a mixture of wariness and assessment. "They kill your people," he stated rather than ask. "At Wagon Place 3 suns ago," Sarah nodded slowly, not lowering her knife. "Yes. How did you—" "Found dead. Saw your tracks." He gestured in the direction they had come. "Those men, bad men, not my people who attacked your wagons." "I know," Sarah whispered, the knife wavering in her grip as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "I heard them talking." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Cannot stay here. They will search when they find courage again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out from the direction of the camp, followed by shouting. The bandits were regrouping, perhaps preparing to hunt down whoever had attacked them. "I'm Sarah," she said, lowering the knife finally. What choice did she have but to trust this stranger? "Sarah Mitchell." The man touched his chest. "Daniel." Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call Daniel Swift River." "Thank you," Sarah began, but her words died as her legs finally gave way beneath her. She crumpled toward the ground, the world spinning around her. Daniel moved with surprising speed, catching her before she could fall completely. "Too long without food, without rest," he observed, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "Need a safe place." Despite her situation, despite everything, Sarah felt a flicker of fear as this stranger, this native warrior, lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. But she lacked the strength to protest, and somewhere in her mind, a voice whispered that if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. Daniel carried her deeper into the woods, moving with a silent grace that seemed impossible for someone bearing her weight. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them as darkness settled completely over the land. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, awareness coming in fragments, the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing, the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet, the stars appearing one by one through gaps in the canopy above. When she next opened her eyes fully, they were in a small ravine, sheltered by an overhanging rock formation. A tiny fire burned, carefully banked to produce minimal smoke. The warmth it radiated was the first real comfort Sarah had felt in days. Daniel knelt beside her, offering a water skin. "Drink. Slow." She accepted it with trembling hands, taking careful sips of the cool water. Each swallow felt like life itself, flowing back into her parched body. "Why?" she asked when she had drunk her fill. "Why help me?" Daniel sat back on his heels, considering her question with the same grave intensity he seemed to apply to everything. In the flickering firelight, she could see details she had missed before. A scar that ran along his jawline, the intricate beadwork on the medicine pouch that hung at his belt, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much. "Many reasons," he answered finally. "None simple." He reached into a leather bag and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. "Eat, sleep. Tomorrow, words will come easier." Sarah accepted the food, tearing off small pieces with her teeth as she'd seen the men of the wagon train do with their jerky. The flavor was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, gamey and smoky. As she ate, Daniel moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning himself where he could watch for any sign of pursuit. His profile against the night sky seemed as much a part of this wild landscape as the trees and rocks that surrounded them. Sarah finished the meat and leaned back against the stone wall behind her, wondering at the strange turn her fate had taken. 3 days ago, she was Sarah Mitchell, a schoolteacher's daughter heading toward a new life in Wyoming territory. Now she was a survivor, dependent on the mercy of a man from a world as foreign to her as the moon. Sleep tugged at her, heavier, with each passing moment. As her eyes drifted closed, her last thought was of how quickly everything could change, how thin the line between life and death, between enemy and ally, between past and future. In her dreams, the massacre played out again and again. But this time, a figure watched from the shadows, a man with dark eyes and a wide-brimmed hat, witnessing her survival with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Dawn broke with a cold clarity that painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold. Sarah woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the rock shelter around her and the small fire that had burned down to glowing embers. Memory flooded back in a rush, the bandits, the arrow, the man called Daniel Swift River who had carried her to safety. She sat up slowly, muscles protesting after days of exertion and poor rest. Her clothes had dried overnight, stiff with dirt, and other stains she preferred not to examine too closely. A quick assessment of her surroundings revealed that she was alone. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had Daniel abandoned her? She reached instinctively for the knife, finding it placed carefully beside the water skin within easy reach. "You sleep." "Like dead," came a voice from the entrance of the small shelter. Daniel ducked inside, carrying a handful of small brownish roots. "Good. Body needs healing." Relief washed over Sarah, followed immediately by embarrassment at her reaction. "I thought that Swift River leaves you." A hint of what might have been amusement touched his eyes. "No. Went to find food. Check for bad men." He knelt by the fire, adding small twigs to coax the embers back to life. They searched still, but go in the wrong direction. South. Sarah watched as he set the roots near the growing flames. "What are those?" "Prairie turnip. Good food. Medicine, too." He glanced at her torn dress and the visible scratches on her arms. "Will help healing." While the roots cooked, Daniel produced a small clay pot from his pack and mixed water with some kind of dried herb. The resulting paste he offered to Sarah, along with a questioning look. She hesitated only briefly before extending her arm, revealing a deep cut just below her elbow that had begun to show angry red lines extending from it. Daniel nodded grimly and began applying the paste with surprisingly gentle fingers. "Infection starts," he explained. "This will fight, but I need more. Have medicine at my camp." He finished treating her wound and sat back. "Can you walk today?" Sarah flexed her feet, assessing the pain in her blistered heels. "Yes," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. He studied her face. "For you, maybe 4. The implied challenge in his words sparked something in Sarah, a stubborn pride she had nearly forgotten during her days of desperate flight. "I can keep up." The hint of a smile ghosted across Daniel's face. "We see." They ate the prairie turnips along with the last of Daniel's dried meat. The food, simple as it was, restored some of Sarah's strength, though she knew it would take more than one meal to recover from her ordeal. As they prepared to leave, Sarah found herself confronting a reality she'd been too exhausted to fully consider the night before. She was placing her trust, her life, in the hands of a man whose people were often portrayed as savages in the stories told around settler campfires. Yet this savage had shown more humanity than the white men who had murdered her father. "Why did you help me?" she asked again as Daniel extinguished the fire with handfuls of dirt. "The truth this time." He paused, regarding her with those unfathomable dark eyes. "Truth has many sides, like river stones." He seemed to debate with himself before continuing. "I follow the tracks from the Wagon place. See, you are alone, hunted." His expression hardened. "Those men, they kill my people too. Say Indians did it. Use fear of Dakota, Lakota to hide their crimes." Sarah frowned. "You were tracking them, the bandits?" Daniel nodded once. "For many moons. They raid, they kill, they blame my people. Then, white soldiers come, punish innocent villages." He shouldered his pack. "You are a witness. You saw the truth. Maybe one day you will speak this truth." The weight of his words settled over Sarah. She had never considered the consequences of the false attribution of attacks. How many innocent people on both sides had died because of such deceptions? "I will," she promised, her voice strengthening, with resolve. "If I live to tell anyone about it." "You live," Daniel said with quiet certainty. "Now we go." They traveled northwest, keeping to ravines and sparse woodland where possible to avoid being spotted. Daniel set a pace that was challenging, but not impossible, occasionally slowing when he noticed Sarah struggling. They spoke little, conversation limited to practical matters, warnings about terrain, brief rests for water, instructions on which plants to avoid. By midday, Sarah's body had settled into the rhythm of the journey, the consistent movement actually, easing some of the stiffness from her muscles. She found herself studying Daniel as they walked, the efficient grace of his movements, the constant awareness he maintained of their surroundings, the way he blended European and native elements in his dress and tools. "You speak English well," she observed during a brief rest beside a small creek. Daniel gave her an appraising look, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Lived at mission school 3 winters, learned white man's words, white man's God." He dipped, his hand in the creek, letting the water flow through his fingers. "Learned how white men think, useful knowledge." "But you left," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Mission wants Dakota to become white inside. Forget old ways. He touched the medicine pouch at his belt. Some ways should not be forgotten. Sarah thought of her own education at the ladies' seminary in Cincinnati, where she had been taught that civilization was a gift being bestowed upon the savage races. Now, facing the reality of the frontier, she wondered which world was truly savage. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the prairie. Twice Daniel froze in mid-step, signaling for Sarah to be still. Each time, after long moments of listening, he would relax slightly and gesture for them. To proceed, she never asked what he had heard or sensed. Some things were better left unknown. As dusk approached, they reached a series of low hills, dotted with juniper and pine. Daniel led her to a sheltered hollow, where a natural spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool before. Trickling away downstream, "We rest here," he announced, shedding his pack. "Good water, hidden." Sarah sank gratefully to the ground, removing her boots to examine her feet. The blisters had broken and resealed several times during the day's journey, creating a painful patchwork of raw and calloused skin. She stifled a groan as she dipped her feet in the cool spring water. Daniel watched her for a moment, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. He returned shortly with a handful of broad leaves and some white chalky stones. Crouching beside the spring, he crushed the stones to powder and mixed it with the masticated leaves. "For feet," he explained, offering the mixture to her. "Will. Draw pain. Help skin grow strong." Sarah hesitated only briefly before applying the paste to her battered feet. The relief was almost immediate, a cooling sensation that dulled the throbbing pain. "Thank you," she said, the words seeming inadequate for all he had done. "You've been—" She searched for the right word. "Kind." Daniel looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Is survival. You help me, I help you." "How have I helped you?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression serious in the deepening twilight. "White woman alone on a prairie has many enemies. White woman with a Dakota hunter has one more, but also has an ally who knows both worlds." He gestured to the vast landscape around them. "This country bleeds from fighting between my people and yours. Maybe some must learn to walk between, to find a new path." The weight of his words settled over Sarah as the first stars appeared overhead. She had lost everything she knew, yet, here in this hollow beside a spring, with a man from a world she had been taught to fear, she felt the first tentative stirring of something unexpected. Not hope, it was too soon for that, but possibility, a future not yet written. As they prepared a small, smokeless fire for the night, Sarah found herself wondering what that future might hold, and whether she would have the courage to walk. The path that was unfolding before her, one step at a time. Morning arrived with a layer of frost that glittered on the grass surrounding their camp. Sarah woke to find Daniel already alert, watching the eastern horizon with a troubled expression. The paste on her feet had dried overnight, forming a protective crust that cracked when she moved. Beneath it, her skin felt less raw, the worst of the blisters beginning to heal. "Storm coming," Daniel said, nodding toward a bank of dark clouds gathering in the distance. "Bad timing." Sarah followed his gaze, noting the ominous wall of grey approaching from the northwest. "How far is your camp?" "Still 2 days, maybe more with storms." He handed her a small bundle of dried berries. "Eat. Need strength today." The berries were tart, but nourishing, easing the hollow feeling in her stomach. As she ate, Sarah took stock of herself. The torn dress that hung loosely on her frame after days of little food, the tangled mess of her hair, the dirt embedded beneath her fingernails. She had never been particularly vain, but the physical transformation reflected a deeper change taking place within her. "Can I—" She gestured toward the spring, embarrassed but determined. "I need to wash." Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. "I will check the trail ahead. Return soon." He gathered his bow and slipped away through the trees, offering her privacy without needing to be asked. Sarah waited until he was out of sight, then stripped off her filthy dress and undergarments. The water was breathtakingly cold, but she forced herself to endure it, scrubbing at her skin and hair with handfuls of sand from the spring's edge. The simple act of washing away days of grime felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. She had just finished dressing when a sound caught her attention, a snapping twig, too heavy to be Daniel's careful footsteps. Sarah froze, her gaze darting to where her knife lay beside her discarded boots. A man emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the spring, bearded, wearing a buckskin jacket stained with grease and gunpowder, one of the bandits. His eyes widened when he saw her, surprise quickly replaced by a predatory smile. "Well now," he drawled, hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Didn't expect to find a lady taking a bath out here." His gaze traveled over her with open hunger. "You must be the one that got away from the wagons." Sarah's mind raced. Daniel was too far to hear a call for help. The knife was several steps away. The bandit had a gun. Her options were few and desperate. Mills was right. Thought he heard something before that arrow took him. The man spat on the ground. "Where's your red-skinned friend, The one who's been leaving us little surprises?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm alone." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the rocks. "Sure you are, darling, and I'm the Queen of England. My father always said, 'Fear is useful, only if it makes you act,'" she replied. The memory came with unexpected clarity. Her father teaching her to shoot his old fowling piece when she was 12, his patient instruction on how to overcome the natural flinch at the recoil. "Your father, he is a warrior." Sarah almost laughed at the idea of Thomas Mitchell, Ohio school teacher and Sunday school teacher, being described as a warrior. No, he was a teacher, but he believed women should know how to protect themselves. Her smile faded. "He died when—" She stopped, unable to complete the sentence. Daniel nodded, accepting this piece of her history without comment. After a moment he reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather bundle. From it he produced a piece of pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries pounded into a dense cake. "Last food," he said, breaking it in half and offering her the larger portion. "Save strength." The storm continued for hours, alternating between violent downpours and periods of steady rain. They remained in the cave, speaking little, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself studying Daniel's profile against the grey light from outside. The sharp line of his jaw, the slight hook of his nose, the single feather tied into his braid that moved gently with each breath. He was not what she had expected. None of this was what she had expected when she had agreed to join her father on the journey west. Life had a way of veering from its intended course, like a river, changing its path after a storm. "When rain stops," Daniel said eventually, "we go north, different way to my camp. Safer. And if they find us before then?" His eyes met hers, steady and certain. "Then we fight. Together." The simple declaration settled over Sarah like a blanket, warming something that had grown cold inside her since the massacre, not just the promise of protection, but the acknowledgement of partnership. We, not I. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder rolling more distantly now. Soon they would need to move again, continuing this journey into the unknown. But for this moment, in this small cave, with rain drumming a gentle rhythm against stone, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps survival was not the only possibility left to her. Perhaps there was still room for something more. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Morning revealed a world washed clean, the hills glistening under a pale blue sky. Puddles dotted the ground, reflecting the clouds that drifted overhead like scattered thoughts. Sarah emerged from the cave, muscles stiff from the cramped quarters. She stretched cautiously, testing her body's limits. To her surprise, she felt stronger than the day before. The combination of rest, food, and Daniel's medicinal treatments had begun to restore her. Daniel was already surveying their surroundings, his gaze sweeping the hills with practiced precision. "Good," he said after a moment. "Rain hides our trail, but also—" He pointed to the softened earth near the cave entrance, where clear footprints were visible. "We'll show our new path." "Can we avoid leaving tracks?" Sarah asked, eyeing the muddy ground with concern. "Not completely, but it can be confusing." He gestured for her to follow, leading her to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a small valley. "See there, stream bigger now from rain. We follow in water when we can, cross often, make the trail hard to read." The strategy made sense. Sarah nodded, adding, "My father once told me that outlaws in the Carolinas would walk backward in their own footprints to fool trackers." Daniel gave her an appraising look. "Your father teaches many useful things." They set off at a steady pace, angling northeast toward the swollen stream that cut through the valley. The going was difficult, the ground treacherous with mud that clung to their boots and made each step an effort. Twice Sarah nearly fell, saved only by Daniel's quick hand at her elbow. When they reached the stream, Daniel paused, studying the rushing water. "Current strong. You swim?" Sarah hesitated. "A little. In ponds. Never in running water." He nodded, considering. "We cross together. Hold here." He indicated a spot on his packstrap. "Step where I step." The water was shockingly cold, the current more powerful than it had appeared from the bank. Sarah clutched Daniel's pack, her knuckles white with effort as the water rose past her knees, then to her thighs. A misstep sent her staggering, but Daniel's arm shot back, steadying her before she could be swept away. They emerged on the far bank, soaked but safe. Sarah's teeth chattered uncontrollably, her wet skirts clinging to her legs like a second skin. Daniel frowned at her shivering form. "Need dry clothes." Wet cloth steals warmth. He glanced at the sun's position. "My camp is still far away. May have to make a fire." "No," Sarah insisted through chattering teeth. "Too dangerous. I'll dry as we walk." Daniel studied her for a moment, then shrugged out of his buckskin jacket. "Wear this, wet, but still holds warmth." When she hesitated, he added, "Not a request. Necessity." The jacket was heavy on her shoulders, still damp from their crossing, but significantly warmer than her sodden dress. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, a musky, earthy scent that was distinctly Daniel. They continued along the stream for nearly an hour, crossing back and forth at Daniel's direction, sometimes walking directly in the shallow parts of the water. Sarah soon understood his strategy. Anyone tracking them would find a confusing pattern of appearing and disappearing footprints, making it impossible to determine a clear direction. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to warm the air, and Sarah's clothes had begun to dry. Her spirits lifted with the temperature, a cautious optimism taking root. Perhaps they would reach Daniel's camp safely after all. "How did you learn to track so well?" she asked during a brief rest. "Is it something all your people know?" Daniel took a sip from his water skin before answering. "All Dakota children learn to read signs. Animal tracks, weather signs, movement in grass. But my father was a scout for many winters. Taught me more." A shadow crossed his face. "Taught me to read white men too." "Your father," Sarah ventured carefully, noting his use of past tense. "Is he dead?" 3 winters passed. Daniel's voice was flat, but his fingers tightened around the water skin. "Soldiers came to the village, said Dakota raid white settlement. Father tried to explain, show proof was not our people." His jaw tightened. They did not listen. Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "I'm sorry." "You did not hold a rifle?" "No, but my people did." She hesitated, then added, "The same sort of men who attacked my wagon train. They've been causing this hatred, haven't they? Creating conflicts between your people and mine. Some men profit from fear," Daniel replied. "Fear makes walls between people. Walls hide truth." They walked in silence after that, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The landscape gradually changed, the hills giving way to a rolling prairie, dotted with stands of cottonwood and willow. Daniel grew more alert as they entered this more exposed terrain, his hand often resting on his knife or moving to the bow slung across his back. Late in the afternoon, they created a small rise, and Daniel suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling for Sarah to do the same. He pointed to a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. "Fire," he whispered. "Not my camp, too soon." Sarah's pulse quickened. "The bandits, maybe? Or travelers? Or," he frowned, studying the smoke pattern, "army. Patrol." Neither option was reassuring. If it was the bandits, the danger was obvious. But an army patrol might be equally threatening to Daniel if they held prejudices against natives, and possibly to Sarah as well if they didn't believe her account of the massacre. "We go round," Daniel decided. "Wide circle. More walking, but safer." The detour took them through a marshy area where the footing was uncertain and clouds of insects swarmed around their faces. Sarah swatted futilely at the buzzing pests, trying to maintain her composure despite the discomfort. She would not complain, would not be a burden. Daniel moved ahead, testing the ground with a stick to avoid the deeper mud patches. He had just helped Sarah across a particularly treacherous spot when he suddenly stiffened, his head turning sharply toward a clump of willows to their left. Sarah followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Daniel slowly reached for his bow, notching an arrow with practiced ease. His eyes never left the willows, which now seemed to Sarah to be swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. A tense moment passed, then the silence was shattered by a guttural growl as a massive shape burst from the willows. A grizzly bear, its fur dark with mud, eyes glinting with rage at the intrusion into its territory. Daniel lost his arrow, the shaft embedding itself in the bear's shoulder. The animal roared in pain but didn't slow, charging directly toward them with terrifying speed. "Run!" Daniel shouted, pushing Sarah toward higher ground as he nocked another arrow. Sarah stumbled backward, her boot catching in the mud. She fell hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Through dazed eyes, she saw Daniel standing his ground, firing. A second arrow that found its mark in the bear's chest. Still, the bear came on, seemingly unstoppable in its fury. Daniel drew his knife, a pitiful weapon against such a monster, and braced himself for the impact. In that moment, with clarity born of desperation, Sarah remembered the pistol taken from the dead bandit at the spring. She had tucked it into the pocket of Daniel's jacket, which she still wore. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, pulling it free as she struggled to her knees. The bear was upon Daniel now, its massive paws swinging in a deadly arc. Daniel ducked beneath the blow, slashing upward with his knife, but the movement put him off balance. The bear's second swing caught him across the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Sarah raised the pistol with both hands, fighting to steady her aim despite her trembling arms. The bear turned toward Daniel's fallen form, jaws open in a roar that seemed to shake the very air. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the marsh, startling a flock of birds into flight from a nearby tree. The bear staggered, a red bloom appearing on its neck where the bullet had found its mark. It swayed on its feet, took one lurching step toward Daniel, then collapsed with a ground-shaking thud. Silence fell, broken only by the distant calls of the startled birds and Sarah's ragged breathing. She lowered the pistol slowly, unable to believe what had just happened. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. He stared at the fallen bear, then at Sarah, his expression a mixture of pain and something else, respect perhaps, or surprise. "Good shot," he said simply. Sarah looked down at the pistol in her hands, still warm from discharge. "I didn't think, She trailed off, suddenly lightheaded. Daniel crossed to her side, examining the bear briefly before kneeling beside her. "You saved my life," he said matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "Debt between us now." "There's no debt," Sarah replied, finding her voice. "You've saved mine twice over." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Then we are even." But as their eyes met over the body of the fallen bear, Sarah knew that nothing between them would ever be that simple again. Something had changed, a shift as subtle yet profound as the turning of the seasons. They had crossed a boundary, invisible, but real, and there would be no going back. The bear's massive form lay still, its blood darkening the marsh grass. Daniel knelt beside it, murmuring words in Dakota that Sarah couldn't understand. His hand rested briefly on the animal's head, in what seemed like a gesture of respect. "We take what bear offers," he said, rising to his feet with a slight wince. "Meat, fur, claws, nothing wasted." Sarah nodded, though the prospect of butchering the massive creature made her stomach turn. She had seen animals dressed for cooking before, but never something so large, never so soon after the kill. "Your shoulder," she said, noticing the way he held it stiffly. "It needs tending." Daniel glanced at the wound, where the bear's claws had torn through his shirt and into the flesh beneath. "Small hurt, bear medicine will help." Before Sarah could question him further, he drew his knife and began the process of harvesting what they needed from the bear. She watched initially, hesitant, but gradually drawn in by the methodical precision of his work. He explained each step, which parts were valuable, how they would be used, the purpose of each careful cut. Despite her initial reluctance, Sarah found herself assisting, following his instructions and learning. The work was messy and difficult, but there was something honest about it, a direct connection to survival that she had never experienced in her previous life. The sun was beginning its descent by the time they finished taking what they could. "Carry!" Daniel wrapped choice cuts of meat in large leaves, along with the bear's gallbladder, which he explained had powerful medicinal properties. The claws he removed with particular care, stringing them on a leather cord. "We cannot stay here," he said, glancing at the sky. "Blood scent travels, attracts predators." They moved away from the marsh, heading toward a small grove of trees that offered some shelter for the night. The day's exertions had taken their toll on both of them. Sarah's muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, and Daniel's injured shoulder had begun to stiffen noticeably. As they set up camp, Sarah insisted on examining his wound. "I may not know your medicine," she said firmly, "but I know a wound that needs cleaning when I see one." To her surprise, Daniel acquiesced without argument. He sat on a fallen log and pulled his torn shirt aside to reveal 3 deep gashes across his upper back and shoulder. The wounds were clean cuts rather than jagged tears, but deep enough to be concerning. Sarah heated water in the small pot from Daniel's pack, then used strips torn from her petticoat to bathe the wounds. Daniel sat, motionless throughout, only the occasional tightening of his jaw betraying his discomfort. "In Cincinnati," she said, working carefully to avoid causing unnecessary pain, "I assisted at the charity hospital. Mostly, I read to patients or brought them water, but I watched the nurses tend to wounds." "You have healer's hands," Daniel observed. Gentle, but not afraid. The simple compliment warmed something in Sarah that had been cold since the massacre. "My mother wanted me to be a proper lady. Music, embroidery, French conversation. But I was always more interested in practical things." She smiled sadly. It disappointed her terribly. Why? Practice keeps you alive. In my world, ladies aren't supposed to concern themselves with survival. They're decorative, like porcelain figurines on a mantle. Daniel snorted. Strange world, where women learn useless things. When the wounds were clean, he showed her how to prepare a paste using the bear's gallbladder mixed with herbs from his medicine pouch. The paste had a strong, bitter smell that made Sarah's nose wrinkle, but Daniel assured her it would prevent the wounds from festering. As night fell, they built a small fire. Daniel cooked strips of bear meat on sticks over the flames, the fat sizzling as it dripped into the fire. The smell made Sarah's mouth water, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. The meat was rich and gamey, unlike anything she had tasted before. Sarah found herself enjoying it despite her initial misgivings. They ate in companionable silence, the crackle of the fire and distant night sounds of the prairie creating a peaceful backdrop. "Tell your husband," Daniel said suddenly. The request caught Sarah off guard. She set down the bone she had been gnawing, gathering her thoughts. "I don't have a husband," she said slowly. "I'm not married." Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Woman your age, traveling west. Unusual to be unmarried." Sarah nodded. "My father was offered a teaching position at a new school in Cheyenne. After my mother died, there wasn't much keeping us in Ohio." She poked at the fire with a stick. "He thought the journey would be healing for both of us. Instead, it brings more sorrow." "Yes," she looked up at him. "What about you? Is there someone waiting for you?" "A wife?" A shadow crossed his face, quickly masked. There was a woman, singing star, from a neighboring village. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. 2 winters ago, sickness came. Many died." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, recognizing the shared experience of loss that connected them. Daniel shrugged, the gesture seemingly casual but belied by the tension in his features. "Life continues, must look forward, not back." His words echoed Sarah's own thoughts since the massacre. Looking back brought only pain and regret. Looking forward, uncertain as it was, offered at least the possibility of something better. They prepared for sleep, Daniel insisting on taking the first watch despite his injury. Sarah wrapped herself in the blanket he offered, surprised by how quickly exhaustion overtook her. Her last conscious thought was that she should be more afraid, alone in the wilderness with a man from a culture she barely understood. Yet somehow she felt safer than she had in days. She woke to Daniel's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Someone comes, many horses." The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Sarah sat up quickly, instantly alert. Daniel was already gathering their few belongings, movement swift and silent despite his injured shoulder. The bandits? No, different. Daniel was already gathering their few belongings, his movements swift and silent despite his injured shoulder. Soldiers, blue coats. Sarah's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and apprehension. U.S. cavalry meant safety and protection, a return to civilization. For her. For Daniel, they might represent something very different. How many? 8, maybe 10, coming from the south. He handed her a small pack of provisions. You go, meet them. Sarah stared at him in confusion. What do you mean? White soldiers help white women. Take you to the fort. Safety. Understanding dawned slowly. You want me to leave you? Is the best chance. Tell soldiers about bandits. Tell the truth of the massacre. Sarah felt something rebel within her at the suggestion. After all they had been through together, the idea of simply walking away seemed unthinkable. And what about you? Where will you go? Continue north, to my people. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Better this way. Better for whom? She demanded, a flare of anger surprising her with its intensity. I wouldn't be alive without you. I won't just abandon you now. Daniel's gaze finally lifted to meet hers, something unreadable in their dark depths. Soldiers see a Dakota man with white woman. Ask. No questions. Shoot first. The harsh reality of his words struck Sarah like a physical blow. He was right, of course. The soldiers would likely assume the worst, that he had captured her, perhaps harmed her. In their eyes, a savage with a white woman could only mean one thing. Then we'll avoid them, she said firmly. Continue to your camp, together. Daniel studied her face, searching for something. Doubt, perhaps, or fear. Finding none, he gave a single nod. Paths are more dangerous now. Soldiers patrol the borders. Of Dakota land, I understand. Sarah straightened her shoulders, decision made. I'm not afraid. A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. No, not afraid. He slung his pack over his good shoulder. Come, we go before light grows stronger. They slipped away from their campsite as the sounds of the approaching patrol grew clearer. Horses' hooves, the jingle of tack, male voices calling commands. Instead of heading directly north as they had planned, Daniel led them west, using a line of hills to screen their movement from distant observers. As the sun rose fully, Sarah glanced back once at the dust cloud that marked the soldiers' passage, her last connection to the world she had known slipping away behind her. The sight should have filled her with regret or longing, but instead, she felt only certainty. Her path lay forward, not back. Whatever awaited her in Daniel's world, she would face it with the same courage that had kept her alive thus far. She turned away from the soldiers and followed Daniel into the unknown, her decision made. The day grew warmer as they traveled, the sun climbing high in a cloudless sky. Daniel led them through increasingly rugged terrain, a landscape of sharp ridges and hidden valleys that seemed designed to confuse and mislead. He moved with the confidence of someone returning to familiar ground, occasionally pausing to study landmarks visible only to his experienced eye. Sarah followed as best she could, noting with surprise that her body was adapting to the demands of their journey. The aches in her muscles had transformed from sharp pain to a dull, persistent throb that she could push aside with sufficient determination. Her city-bred softness was being steadily replaced by a newfound resilience. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the cavalry patrol. Daniel finally slowed their pace, allowing a brief rest beside a small spring that bubbled up between moss-covered rocks. "We make good time," he observed, filling their water skins. "Reach my people's summer camp by tomorrow, if there is no more trouble." Sarah knelt beside him, splashing cool water on her face. "Will your people welcome me?" Daniel's expression turned thoughtful. "Some, yes. Some, no." He met her gaze directly. Chief Greyhawk is a wise man, but cautious with white settlers. Too many broken promises. I'm hardly a settler now, Sarah said with a wry smile. Truth, he nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. But still, prepare for a difficult welcome. Stay close to me. They continued their journey, angling northeast through a series of narrow passes that gradually opened into a broader valley. The vegetation changed subtly, more pine and spruce appearing among the cottonwoods, the grass growing shorter and more sparse on the rocky slopes. As they walked, Daniel began pointing out features of the landscape that would have escaped Sarah's notice, the nearly invisible game trail they followed, plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, signs of animals that had passed recently. There, he said, indicating a patch of disturbed earth beneath an overhanging ledge. Badger den. Good sign. Why is that good? Sarah asked, seeing nothing remarkable about the burrow. Badger chooses safe places, where food, water close, where larger predators do not hunt. He tapped his temple. Badger smart. We learn from badgers. Sarah found herself absorbing these lessons eagerly, filing away knowledge that would have seemed irrelevant in her previous life, but now might mean the difference between survival and death. There was a strange freedom in this new existence, stripped of social conventions and expectations, reduced to the essential business of staying alive. Late in the afternoon, they created a ridge, and Daniel suddenly raised his hand, signaling for Sarah to stop. He dropped into a crouch, motioning for her to do the same. "What is it?" she whispered, scanning the landscape ahead but seeing nothing unusual. Daniel pointed to a distant rise where a single figure on horseback was silhouetted against the sky. "Watch her." Sarah squinted against the sun's glare. "One of your people?" "Yes." "Scout who watches the borders of our hunting grounds." Daniel studied the distant figure. "He sees us already." As if in confirmation, the scout raised a hand in a deliberate gesture. Daniel stood slowly and returned the signal, adding a second motion that Sarah couldn't interpret. "Now he knows I return with a stranger," Daniel explained. "He will ride to camp, bring news." "Is that good or bad?" Sarah asked, rising to stand beside him. "Depends on news already in camp." A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "Last month, tensions with white settlers grew worse. More trouble since I left." He didn't need to finish the thought. Sarah understood the precarious position she might be in, a white woman arriving in a Dakota camp during a time of conflict between their peoples. The scout wheeled his horse and disappeared over the rise, riding hard toward the north. Daniel watched him go, then turned to Sarah with an uncharacteristically grave expression. "Listen carefully," he said. "When we reach camp, some may speak harsh words, show anger. Do not react. Do not show fear." His eyes held hers with urgent intensity. "I give protection, but you must be strong yourself." Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "I understand." "Good." He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. Unwrapping it, he revealed a carved stone, bare, small enough to fit in her palm, polished to a dull sheen by years of handling. "My father made this," Daniel said, pressing it into her hand. "Protection. Spirit bear you killed gives strength. This gives—" He searched for the word, "belonging." Sarah closed her fingers around the small carving, deeply moved by the gesture. "I can't take this. It was your father's." "Now it's yours," he said firmly. "Keep close. When afraid, remember the bear fell by your hand. You earned a place." The weight of the small stone in her palm felt somehow significant, a tangible connection to Daniel's world, a talisman against the unknown, challenges ahead. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, feeling its reassuring solidity against her hip. They continued their journey as the shadows lengthened across the valley. Sarah noticed Daniel becoming increasingly alert, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. Once he paused abruptly, head cocked as if listening, though she heard nothing unusual. "Someone follows," he said quietly, hand moving to his knife. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the afternoon warmth. The bandits. No. Different. He studied the trail behind them, eyes narrowed. One person, moving quite, skilled. He frowned. Another scout, maybe. His expression remained troubled. Or someone who tracks both of us. They resumed walking, but now Daniel adjusted their path, leading them through areas of rocky ground where tracks would be difficult to leave. He set a quick pace that had Sarah struggling to keep up, her newly developed stamina tested by the rough terrain and increasing elevation. The sun was beginning to set when they entered a dense stand of pines. The sudden dimness beneath the canopy was disorienting after hours in open country. Sarah stayed close to Daniel, fighting the impression that eyes watched from the shadowed spaces between trees. Without warning, Daniel stopped. Sarah nearly collided with his back, catching herself. Just in time. She peered around him to see what had caused the abrupt halt. 3 Dakota warriors stood blocking their path, bows drawn and arrows pointed directly at them. Their faces were painted with red and black streaks, their expressions impassive and unwelcoming. One of them, the center figure, taller than the others, spoke sharply in Dakota. Daniel responded calmly in the same language, his hands held slightly away from his weapons in a non-threatening gesture. The exchange continued for several tense moments, voices low but intensity clear even to Sarah, who couldn't understand the words. Finally, the tall warrior lowered his bow slightly, though his companions maintained their aim. He switched to heavily accented English, directing his words at Sarah. "Why did you come here, white woman?" Sarah stepped forward, grateful that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I survived a massacre. Daniel saved my life." The warrior's eyes narrowed. "Massacre by who?" "White men. Bandits who attack both your people and mine, then blame Indians for their crimes." A flicker of surprise crossed the warrior's face before his expression hardened again. "You witnessed this?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "I saw everything. I can testify to the truth." The 3 warriors exchanged glances. The tall one spoke again to Daniel, who nodded and replied. After another moment of consideration, the warrior gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. "Chief must hear." "This," he said. "You come." But his gaze fixed on Sarah with unmistakable warning. "You walk with blind eyes?" Daniel turned to Sarah, his expression conveying the seriousness of the situation. "They fear you will learn a path to the village. For protection." "I understand," Sarah said, though the prospect of being blindfolded in this unfamiliar wilderness sent a surge of anxiety through her. The tall warrior produced a strip of woven cloth. Daniel took it from him and approached Sarah. "Trust me," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "No harm comes while I guide." Sarah nodded, closing her eyes as he placed the cloth over them, tying it securely at the back of her head. The sudden darkness was disorienting, heightening her other senses, the scent of pine, the sound of wind through branches, the murmur of voices in a language she couldn't understand. She felt Daniel's hand close around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "I lead. Step where I step." They began to move forward, Sarah placing her trust entirely in Daniel's guidance. It was perhaps the most vulnerable she had been since the massacre, unable to see, surrounded by those who might wish her harm, in territory utterly unknown to her. Yet strangely, as they journeyed deeper into Dakota land, she felt something unexpected beginning to take root within her. Not fear, though that was certainly present. Something else. A sense that every step carried her further from the woman she had been and closer to someone new, someone stronger, Someone who might, against all odds, find a place in this harsh new world. The carved bear pressed against her hip with each step, a reminder of Daniel's words. You earned a place. She hoped, as they led her blindfolded toward the unknown, that it would prove true. The journey through darkness seemed endless. Sarah concentrated on the pressure of Daniel's hand guiding her, the sound of his voice occasionally murmuring instructions. Step high here, duck branches, careful, stones. The only constants in her blindfolded world. The voices of the warriors surrounded her, their Dakota language flowing like water over rocks, sometimes sharp with what sounded like disagreement, other times low and urgent. When they finally stopped, she could sense a change in the air. Smoke. From cooking fires, the distant sound of voices and movement, the barking of dogs. They had reached the Dakota camp. Ready? Daniel asked quietly near her ear. Sarah nodded, her throat too dry for words. The blindfold was removed, and she blinked against the fading evening light, taking in her surroundings. The Dakota summer camp spread before her in the sheltered valley. Perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a rough circle, some constructed of hides stretched over wooden frames, others more permanent structures of bark and wood. Cook fires flickered throughout the camp, sending thin columns of smoke into the darkening sky. Children paused in their play to stare at the newcomers. Women stood from their work with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Men approached with hands resting on weapons. Daniel stood tall beside her, his face composed but alert. The tall warrior who had confronted them in the forest moved ahead, calling out to the gathering crowd. A ripple of reaction passed through the assembly, surprise, anger, suspicion. A path cleared through the people as an elderly man emerged from the largest lodge at the center of the camp. His face was deeply lined with age, his long gray hair bound with a single eagle feather. Despite his years, he moved with the straight-back dignity of one accustomed to authority. Chief Greyhawk, Daniel said under his breath, show respect. Do not speak until spoken to. The chief approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Sarah's appearance. The torn and stained dress, the tangled hair, the mixture of fear and determination in her stance. He spoke in Dakota to Daniel, who responded at length, occasionally gesturing towards Sarah or in the direction from which they had traveled. Sarah stood silently, acutely aware of the stares from all sides. Children whispered behind their hands, nudged by mothers into silence. Young warriors watched, with undisguised suspicion. A few of the older women studied her with expressions that seemed more calculating than hostile. Finally, Chief Greyhawk turned his attention fully to Sarah, addressing her in halting but understandable English. Swift River says you survive when all others die, says you witness the truth of who kills your people. Yes, Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. I saw everything. It was white men, bandits pretending to be Indians. They've been raiding both settler wagons and native villages, stirring hatred between our peoples. The chief's weathered face remained impassive. Why should we believe white woman's words? White tongues often speak lies about Dakota. Sarah felt the weight of every eye upon her. This moment, her response, would determine not just her welcome, but possibly her survival. Her fingers found the carved bear in her pocket, drawing strength from its solidity. I have no reason to lie, she said. I've lost everything, my father, my possessions, my future in Wyoming. The men who destroyed all that are still out there, free to continue their crimes against both our peoples. She met the chief's gaze, directly. The truth is all I have left to offer. Greyhawk studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and spoke at length to a small group of older men who had gathered behind him, council members, Sarah guessed, by their attentive posture and the respect shown to them by others. One of them, a man with a deeply scarred face and Only one eye spoke forcefully, gesturing towards Sarah with obvious disapproval. Another, wearing an elaborate necklace of bear claws, seemed to argue in her favor, pointing to Daniel's wounded shoulder. The debate continued as darkness fell completely. Over the camp, more torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across the gathered faces. Sarah stood motionless beside Daniel, determined not to show the exhaustion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, Chief Greyhawk raised his hand, silencing the council's discussion. He turned back to Sarah and Daniel. "Woman will. Stay," he announced. 3 days. Council hears the full story tomorrow when my mind rested." He pointed to a small lodge at the edge of the camp. "Stay there. Watched always." With that, he turned and walked back toward the central lodge, the council members following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, though many continued to cast curious or hostile glances toward Sarah. "Good outcome," Daniel said quietly as they began walking toward the designated lodge. "Better than expected." "Being watched at all times is good?" Sarah whispered back. "Not killing immediately is good," Daniel replied with unexpected frankness. "Rest. We will talk more later." The small lodge was sparsely furnished, 2 sleeping pallets of pine boughs covered with buffalo robes, a central fire pit, a few clay vessels for water. A young woman entered shortly after them, silently placing a wooden bowl of stew and a water skin near the fire before departing without meeting Sarah's eyes. "Who was that?" Sarah asked, sinking gratefully onto one of the pallets as her legs finally gave way beneath her. "Singing bird, my sister's daughter." Daniel sat across from her, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "She is curious about you. She didn't look at me, Dakota way, watch without seeming to watch." A hint of amusement touched his expression. "Women in my family see everything." Sarah managed a tired smile at that. "Women everywhere see everything. Men just don't notice us." This drew a small chuckle from Daniel, a sound Sarah realized she had never heard from him before. The brief moment of lightness felt precious amid the tension of their situation. They ate the stew, a rich mixture of venison, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots, in companionable silence. Sarah found herself studying the interior of the lodge, noting the craftsmanship of the structure, the practical arrangement of the sparse belongings. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked finally. "Council meets. You tell a story, full story, every detail. They decide if it is the truth or a lie. And if they decide I'm lying." Daniel didn't answer immediately. "Sleep," he said instead. "Need strength. For tomorrow." Sarah lay down on the buffalo robe, its musky scent oddly comforting after days in the wilderness. Exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind raced with anxiety about the coming day. Her testimony before the council would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future relationship between the Dakota and nearby settlers. "Daniel," she said softly into the darkness, "thank you for bringing me here. For trusting me." There was a long pause before he replied. "You trusted first, following Dakota warriors into unknown land. I had no choice. Always choose. Could have gone to soldiers, choose the safety of your own people." Sarah considered this. He was right, of course. She had made a choice when she decided to continue with him rather than seek out the cavalry patrol. A choice that had led her here, to this lodge, to tomorrow's testimony. "Get sleep," Daniel said, his voice already heavy with approaching slumber. "Tomorrow comes soon." Despite her anxiety, Sarah found herself drifting off, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the Dakota camp. Distant voices, the occasional laugh or cry of a child, dogs barking at something in the night. Different from the sounds of Cincinnati, different from the wagon train, yet somehow containing the same essential human elements. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a strange one. that perhaps the distance between her world and Daniel's was not as vast as she had once believed. Morning arrived with a soft touch on her shoulder. Sarah opened her eyes to find a young woman, Singing Bird, Daniel's niece, kneeling beside her pallet. The girl's dark eyes were serious but not unfriendly as she offered a small wooden cup of steaming liquid. "Drink," she said, her English surprisingly clear. "Give strength to the council." Sarah sat up, accepting the cup with murmured thanks. The tea was bitter but invigorating, clearing the fog of sleep from her mind. She glanced around the lodge to find that Daniel was already gone. "Where is—" "Uncle speaks with elders," Singing Bird answered, setting out a clean dress, simple in design but carefully made from soft buckskin. "You wear this, your dress." She gestured at Sarah's torn and stained clothing with a slight grimace. Sarah hesitated, touched by the unexpected kindness but uncertain about adopting Dakota dress before the council. Would it seem presumptuous, an attempt to curry favor? Singing Bird seemed to read her thoughts. Council respects clean appearance, shows respect back. She pointed to Sarah's matted hair. "I help with this too." Recognizing the wisdom in the young woman's advice, Sarah accepted the dress and allowed Singing Bird to help her wash and comb her tangled hair into a simple braid. The transformation was remarkable. The buckskin dress fit surprisingly well, and the simple act of being clean again restored something of her dignity. "Thank you," Sarah said when they had finished. "This is very kind." Singing Bird shrugged, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Uncle says you are a brave woman, shot bear to save him." She touched the bear claw necklace she wore. "Bear spirit strong in you now." Before Sarah could respond, the hide covering the lodge entrance was pulled aside. A stern-faced warrior, one of those who had escorted them to the camp the previous evening, gestured for her to follow. "Council waits," he said gruffly. With a deep breath and a final grateful nod to Singing Bird, Sarah stepped out to face whatever judgment awaited her. The council lodge stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others and marked with totemic symbols painted on its exterior. As Sarah approached, flanked by her stern warrior escort, she could see that a significant gathering had already assembled inside. The morning sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top, casting dappled patterns across the assembled faces. Chief Greyhawk sat at the head of the circle, his weathered face impassive. To his right was the scarred elder who had argued against her the previous evening, his single eye regarding her with undisguised suspicion. To his left, the man with the bear claw necklace, the one who had spoken in her favor, nodded slightly. As she entered, Daniel stood to one side, his posture formal, face carefully neutral. He did not acknowledge her directly, but his presence provided a measure of reassurance. "Come forward," Chief Greyhawk instructed, gesturing to the center of the circle. "Sit here." Sarah took her place on the woven mat indicated, conscious of the many eyes upon her. Women of the tribe had gathered at the periphery of the lodge, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Among them, she spotted Singing Bird, who offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You claim to witness an attack on a wagon train," Greyhawk began without preamble. "Tell us what you saw, every detail from the beginning." Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. This was perhaps the most important story she would ever tell. Lives, both Dakota and settler, might depend on her ability to convey the truth convincingly. "We were part of the Westbrook wagon train," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 18 of us are bound for Wyoming territory. Families mostly, the Hendersons, the Millers, the Prestons. My father, Thomas Mitchell, and I joined in independence. She described the journey. 6 weeks on the trail, the crossing of the Missouri River, the gradual shift in landscape as they entered the plains. 3 mornings ago, just before dawn, I went to gather kindling for the breakfast fire," Sarah continued, forcing herself to relive the terrible moments she had been trying to forget. We had camped in a small valley near a stream. I was maybe 100 yards from the nearest wagon when I heard the first shots. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the horror of what followed. Hiding in the tall grass, watching as the attackers systematically murdered the members of the wagon train. She described the men in detail, their clothing, their weapons, the way they moved and spoke. They were white men, she emphasized. Some wore pieces of native dress, feathers, beaded strips, but it was obviously false, a disguise. They spoke English to each other and used white men's curses. The one-eyed elder leaned forward. How do you survive when all others die? I was already away from camp when the attack began, Sarah explained. I hid in the grass, then under an overturned wagon. They were careless, confident no one had escaped, more interested in looting than searching thoroughly. She described her 3 days alone, the desperate flight through unfamiliar territory, finally encountering the same men at their camp. I heard them talking, she said, meeting the chief's gaze directly. They spoke of the good haul from the wagons. One said they should have kept some of the women. Another said, next time we won't be so hasty. They were the same men who attacked us, not Indians, as they wanted it to appear. The council members exchanged glances. The man with the bear claw necklace spoke in Dakota to Greyhawk, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Sarah. These men, you know who they are? Sarah shook her head. I never saw them before the attack, but they seemed familiar with the territory. They mentioned a trading post to the east where they could sell the stolen goods. Peterson's outpost. I think they called it Peterson, Daniel interjected, speaking for the first time. Several heads turned toward him. Only trading post 3 days' ride east, known to deal with stolen goods. Greyhawk's expression darkened. Peterson man has brought much trouble. Buys furs from Dakota land. Claims we steal from white trappers. The Shah, one-eyed elder, Running Wolf, Sarah had heard others call him, spoke rapidly in Dakota, gesturing emphatically. Though Sarah couldn't understand his words, the meaning was clear. He remained unconvinced, suspicious of her account. Running Wolf asks why we should believe you, Greyhawk translated. Says white woman would say anything to save herself. Sarah felt a surge of frustration but kept her voice measured. What reason would I have to lie? If I wanted to blame your people for the massacre, I would have gone to the soldiers we saw yesterday. I would not be here, alone among you, telling a story that places blame on my own kind. This caused a murmur among the gathered council. The logic of her argument was difficult to refute. There is more, Daniel said, stepping forward slightly. Women could have joined soldiers. Choose to continue with me instead. Choose truth over the easy path. Running Wolf spoke again, his tone challenging. Daniel responded with equal intensity, and soon multiple voices joined the debate, the Dakota language flowing too rapidly for Sarah to follow any of it. Greyhawk raised his hand, silencing the council. One more question, he said to Sarah. These men who attack, how many? I saw 6 clearly, she replied. There may have been more. Their leader was a tall man with a long scar across his cheek, red hair. He wore a black hat with a silver band. Called himself Jackson. A shocked silence fell over the council. Sarah opened her eyes to find every face staring at her with new intensity. You know him, she said slowly, recognizing the reaction. Who is he? Greyhawk exchanged glances with the other elders before answering. Man you describe as Franklin Jackson, once an army scout, now, he searched for the English word, outlaw. He led an attack on the Dakota hunting party 1 month ago, killed many, including my nephew. My cousin's husband, Daniel added quietly. His son, too. Sarah turned to him, understanding dawning. This was why he had been tracking the bandits, why he had been so quick to help her. Their paths had converged through shared tragedy. Jackson claims Dakota attacked settlers, Greyhawk continued. The army believes, sends soldiers, threatens war if raids continue. But it's not your people raiding, Sarah said, anger kindling within her. It's Jackson and his men, creating conflict for their own profit. Yes, the chief confirmed grimly. But who believes the Dakota word against white man's? Even with a peace treaty, white soldiers are quick to blame, slow to listen. The elder, with the bear claw necklace, stone hand, Sarah heard someone call him, spoke at length, his tone measured but forceful. Others joined in, the debate resuming with new urgency. Sarah watched their faces, wishing she could understand their words, but reading much in their expressions and gestures. Finally, Greyhawk called for silence once more. He studied Sarah thoughtfully before speaking. "Council believes your words. Carry truth," he announced. "Story fits with what we know of Jackson. What we do not know is what to do with you now." Sarah hadn't considered this question. In focusing on convincing the council of the truth, she hadn't thought beyond that immediate goal. "I want justice," she said firmly. "For my father, for the others who died, for your people who have been blamed for Jackson's crimes." "Justice is hard to find on the frontier," Greyhawk replied. "White law does not listen to Dakota, and white woman who lives with Dakota." He shook his head. "White law does not listen to her either." The truth of this statement settled heavily in the lodge. Sarah was caught between worlds, no longer fully part of white settler society, not truly accepted among the Dakota. Her testimony would be dismissed or discredited in both courts. There must be a way, she insisted. Someone who would listen, who would have the authority to investigate Jackson's gang. Daniel, who had been silent during the latter part of the council, stepped forward. "There is one, Major William Bradford at Fort Kearney, man of honor, has worked for fair treatment of both peoples." Several council members nodded in recognition of the name. Even Running Wolf, the suspicious one-eyed elder, grunted what sounded like grudging agreement. "Bradford knows Dakota speaks the truth," Greyhawk confirmed, "but Fort Kearney took many days' journey, dangerous path." "I'll go," Sarah said without hesitation. "I'll testify to what I saw." Her declaration caused another stir among the council. Daniel's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or concern, possibly both. Greyhawk conferred briefly with the other elders before turning back to Sarah. "Council will consider this path. Until a decision is made, you stay in camp. Learn our ways." His gaze was penetrating. "Show if you truly stand for truth, or only for your own survival." With that, the council session ended. The elders rose, filing out of the lodge with measured dignity. The women followed, many casting curious glances at Sarah as they departed. Daniel approached her as the lodge emptied. "You did well," he said quietly. "Council rarely believes in an outsider so quickly." "What happens now?" Sarah asked suddenly, exhausted by the emotional strain of reliving the massacre. "Now we wait. Council debates, decides." He offered his hand to help her rise from the mat. "And you learn what it means to live among Dakota." As they stepped outside into the bright, midday sun, Sarah realized that a new chapter of her journey was beginning. The testimony was over, but the greater challenge, finding her place in this unfamiliar world, was just beginning. The days that followed Sarah's testimony unfolded in a rhythm entirely foreign to her previous life. While the council deliberated on the matter of Fort Kearney, she found herself immersed in the daily patterns of Dakota existence, not as a guest or observer, but as a participant. Singing Bird became her guide and reluctant teacher, showing Sarah how to perform the tasks expected of Dakota women. The chief's decision that she should learn their ways was being taken quite literally by the tribe. "You hold wrong, singing." Bird sighed, adjusting Sarah's grip on the bone scraper she was using to prepare a deer skin. "Like this, firm but gentle. Two hard damage hides, two soft leaves flesh. Sarah repositioned her hands, feeling the blisters forming despite the calluses she had developed during her days in the wilderness. The work was physically demanding in ways she had never experienced. The constant bending, the repetitive motions, the precision required even when muscles trembled with fatigue. "In Cincinnati," she said between strokes, "I had a cook who did the meals and cleaning. I spent my mornings playing piano or needlework." Singing Bird looked puzzled. "Piano?" Sarah tried to explain the instrument, mimicking the motion of playing. "Keys." Singing Bird laughed. "Sounds like a man's toy. Not useful." She gestured at the half-scraped hide. "This keeps the family warm in winter. What does piano do?" The question gave Sarah pause. What, indeed? So many of the accomplishments she had been raised to value seemed absurdly impractical in this new context. As the afternoon sun beat down, a group of children ran past, shouting and laughing in a game of chase. One small boy, perhaps 5 years old, stumbled and fell heavily, scraping his knee on a stone. Instead of crying, he pushed himself up, brushed off the dirt, and rejoined the game with barely a wince. "Dakota children learn early," Singing Bird commented, following Sarah's gaze. "Pain is a teacher, weakness not honored. In my world, mothers rush to comfort crying children," Sarah said. "We protect them from pain when we can." Singing Bird's expression turned thoughtful. "Different ways, not wrong, just different. Here, children must be strong to survive." She returned to her work. "Like you must be strong now." The observation struck Sarah more deeply than Singing Bird likely intended. Strength in this world was measured differently, not by social graces or marriage prospects, but by one's ability to endure, to contribute, to survive. By midday, they joined the other women at the cooking fires. Sarah's hands were raw, her back aching, but she felt a strange sense of accomplishment in the properly prepared hide, in the skills, however rudimentary, she was beginning to acquire. Some of the women still regarded her with suspicion, keeping their distance and speaking Dakota when she was near, clearly discussing her. Others had begun to accept her presence with grudging tolerance, occasionally correcting her technique or offering small nods of approval when she managed a task correctly. One elderly woman, White Cloud, had taken a particular interest in Sarah, though she spoke no English. She communicated through gestures and expressions, showing Sarah which plants could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, which were to be avoided. "She lost daughter to white man's sickness," Singing Bird explained when Sarah asked about the old woman's attention. "Maybe you were sent to learn her knowledge before she joins your ancestors." The responsibility of this unexpected mentorship weighed on Sarah. These were not simple cooking tips or housekeeping skills being shared. They were survival knowledge accumulated over generations, sacred in their way. Throughout these days of learning, Daniel remained a distant figure. She caught glimpses of him in council meetings, training with younger warriors, and departing on hunting expeditions. When their paths did cross, he acknowledged her with a nod or brief greeting, but the easy companionship of their journey seemed to have evaporated within the confines of the camp. The evening of her 4th day among the Dakota, Sarah sat alone. Outside her lodging, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The small carved bear rested in her palm, its smooth surface warmed by her touch. "Bear spirit speaks to you." Daniel's voice came from behind her, surprising Sarah with its suddenness. He moved silently, even in camp. "I don't know about spirits," she admitted, as he sat beside her on the fallen log. "But it reminds me that I'm stronger than I once believed." Daniel nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "Council finishes discussion tomorrow. Decision comes about Fort Kearney." Sarah's heart quickened. Have they given any indication of their thinking? Divided. Some say the risk is too great. Jackson's men watched trails, army patrols suspicious of Dakota. He glanced at her. Others say truth must be told no matter the danger. I still wish to go, she said without hesitation, for justice, for your cousin's family, for mine. A moment of silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way their recent interactions had not been. Why have you been avoiding me? Sarah asked finally, the question that had been troubling her for days. Daniel's expression remained carefully neutral, not avoiding, giving space. Here, you are white woman in Dakota camp, different from women alone in the wilderness. He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. Some watch how I treat you, judge both of us by this. Understanding dawned slowly. Their closeness on the journey, born of necessity and shared danger, carried different implications within the social structure of the camp. Daniel's position, his respect among his people, could be compromised by appearing too attached to an outsider. I see, Sarah said softly. I wouldn't want to cause problems for you here. Not a problem, Daniel corrected. Complication. Different. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the camp's edge. Warriors were gathering, weapons in hand, responding to something beyond Sarah's view. Daniel rose immediately, alert and tense. Stay here, he instructed, already moving toward the disturbance. Sarah hesitated only briefly before following at a discreet distance. Whatever was happening might affect her as well, and she was tired of being sheltered from difficult truths. At the camp's perimeter, a small group of warriors surrounded a kneeling figure, a white man, bloodied and bound, his face a mass of bruises. Chief Greyhawk stood before him, expression grave as Running Wolf reported something in rapid Dakota. Found near Wolf Creek, Daniel translated quietly for Sarah, who had come to stand beside him despite his instructions. Watching camp, when caught, try to fight. The captive raised his head, revealing a face that made Sarah gasp with recognition despite the injuries. She knew him, one of Jackson's men, the youngest of the bandits she had glimpsed at their camp. Greyhawk turned at her reaction. You know this man? Yes, Sarah confirmed, stepping forward. He was with the bandits, one of Jackson's gang. A ripple of tension passed through the gathered Dakota. The captive's eyes widened as he recognized Sarah. You're dead, he rasped, disbelief evident beneath his fear. You died in the wagons with the rest. Clearly not, Sarah replied coldly. Unlike my father, unlike the children your gang murdered. Greyhawk addressed the captive in halting English. Why do you watch our camp? The young bandit's gaze darted between the armed warriors surrounding him. Jackson sent me, he said, desperation loosening his tongue. Said to find the Indian who's been picking us off, the one who took Mills with an arrow, and to look for any survivors from the wagon train. How did Jackson know to look here? Daniel demanded. Army patrol, the captive replied. They reported seeing a white woman with a Dakota brave heading north. Jackson figured it had to be the one that got away. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Jackson knew she had survived, knew she was a witness to his crimes, and now knew exactly where to find her. Greyhawk spoke rapidly to the council members who had joined the gathering. The debate was brief but intense, concluding with a sharp nod from the chief. Take him to the council lodge, he ordered. We learn what else he knows. As the warriors hauled the captive away, Greyhawk turned to Sarah and Daniel. This changes the path ahead. Jackson now hunts both of you, knows you can tell the truth of his crimes. All the more reason to reach Fort Kearney, Sarah argued, before he silences us permanently. Greyhawk studied her with newfound respect. You have the courage of a Dakota woman, even in white skin. He glanced at the darkening sky. Council meets now, not tomorrow. Decision cannot wait with the enemy. So close, the chief strode toward the council lodge, calling for the elders to join him. Daniel moved to follow. then paused, turning back to Sarah. "Stay in your lodge," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument this time. "Postguards outside. I will return when the council finishes." Sarah wanted to protest, but recognized the genuine concern in his eyes. This was not about keeping her away from tribal matters, but about protecting her from very real danger. She nodded her agreement and headed back to her small dwelling, her decision about Fort Kearny now carrying even greater urgency. The council's deliberations lasted well into the night. Sarah sat in her lodge, listening to the muffled sounds of the camp, hushed conversations outside, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft lullaby a mother sang to quiet her child. Despite the ordinary nature of these sounds, there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present before. The capture of Jackson's scout had changed everything. 2 young warriors stood guard outside her dwelling, their silhouettes occasionally visible against the hide walls when they moved. Their presence was both reassuring and unsettling. Protection, yes, but also a reminder of the danger that had followed her to this place. Singing Bird had departed after arranging protective fetishes at the lodge entrance, small bundles of herbs and feathers that she explained would ward off evil. Whether they worked or not, the gesture was touching. "Uncle will protect you," Singing Bird had said with absolute certainty. "He has seen your spirit." Sarah had looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Singing Bird seemed surprised by the question. "You do not know? In our ways, when a person saves another from death, spirits are joined. When you killed a bear that would take his life, your spirit spoke to him." She fingered the bear claw at her neck. This is powerful medicine between warriors. The implications of this cultural belief settled over Sarah like a blanket, both comforting and weighty with responsibility. In Daniel's worldview, they were connected not just by circumstance or mutual aid, but by something deeper, something spiritual. It was well past midnight when the hide covering her lodge entrance was pushed aside. Daniel ducked inside, his expression grave in the dim light of the small fire. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "Council has decided," he said without preamble, settling cross-legged before the fire. Sarah sat up straighter, heart quickening. "What will happen?" "Many things." Daniel added a small stick to the fire, watching the flames catch. "Camp moves. At dawn. Deeper into Dakota territory, harder to find. Women, children, and elders go north to summer hunting grounds by a great lake." "And us?" Sarah asked, noting his phrasing. Daniel met her gaze directly. "We go to Fort Kearny. You, me, 4 warriors. Try to reach Major Bradford before Jackson finds us." Relief and anxiety washed through Sarah in equal measure. The council had agreed to her plan, but the journey would be perilous with Jackson actively hunting them. What about the bandit, the one who was caught? A shadow crossed Daniel's face. He gave information, names of others in Jackson's gang, location of their camp, plans to blame the next raid on the Pawnee tribe to the south. He paused. "He will not return to Jackson." Sarah didn't press for details, understanding the implication. The young bandit had met tribal justice for his crimes against the Dakota people. "When do we leave?" "Before dawn. Secret path. Need to travel light, fast." Daniel produced a small bundle from his pack. "Brought these for my journey." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal moccasins made of soft deer hide, decorated with subtle beadwork. "Singing Bird made for you. Better than boots for quiet travel." Sarah accepted the gift, touched by the young woman's thoughtfulness. "Please thank her for me." "Thank yourself. She says you learn well for white woman." A hint of amusement flickered in Daniel's eyes. High praise from Dakota girl. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, packing only essential supplies, reviewing the route they would take, discussing contingencies if they encountered trouble. It was a grim but necessary conversation, both of them acutely aware of the stakes. "Rest now," Daniel said finally. "Need strength for days ahead." Sarah nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with her mind racing. As Daniel rose to leave, she called after him. "What did the council learn about Jackson's whereabouts? How close is he?" Daniel hesitated, clearly debating whether to share this information. "One day's ride southwest, camp near a trading post called Peterson's Outpost." "So close," Sarah whispered, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. "Yes, why do we leave different directions, use Dakota paths through hills?" He studied her face. "Are you afraid?" It would have been easy to lie, to pretend bravery she didn't entirely feel, but Sarah had learned that honesty between them was more valuable than pride. "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to turn back. Fear is useful only if it makes you act. Remember?" Daniel nodded, recognition flickering in his eyes at her reference to her father's teaching. "Good fear makes feet quick, eyes sharp. Bad fear makes your heart freeze." He adjusted his pack. "Your fear is good." With that assessment, he departed, leaving Sarah to prepare herself for what might be the most dangerous journey of her life. Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with pursuing, shadows and the echoing sound of gunfire. Sarah woke before the designated hour, her body tense with anticipation. Outside, the camp was stirring with quiet purpose. Families preparing for their own journey north, warriors readying weapons and horses. The 4 warriors who would accompany them to Fort Kearney were already gathered at the edge of the clearing when Sarah arrived. Stone Hand, the elder with the bear claw necklace. Swift Elk, a middle-aged warrior known for his tracking skills. Wolf Runner, younger than the others but renowned for his endurance. And to Sarah's surprise, Running Wolf, the one-eyed elder who had been most skeptical of her testimony. "Running Wolf comes," she asked Daniel quietly as she approached. "His choice," Daniel replied. "Says old eyes see the truth others miss. Good tracker before injury." Chief Greyhawk appeared as they prepared to depart, his weathered face solemn in the early light. He spoke briefly to each warrior in Dakota, clasping their forearms in a gesture of respect and farewell. When he came to Sarah, he switched to English. "You carry the Dakota truth now," he said gravely. "Heavy burden for any shoulders. Heavier for women alone between worlds." "I'm not alone," Sarah replied, glancing at Daniel and the others. Greyhawk nodded, approval warming his dark eyes. "No, not alone." He pressed something into her hand, a small carved token bearing symbols she didn't recognize. "Show this to Bradford. He knows Greyhawk's mark. Now go. Speak with a straight tongue." With these final words of guidance, the chief stepped back, raising his hand in a gesture of blessing or farewell, perhaps both. The small party mounted their horses, Sarah somewhat awkwardly, as she was still adapting to riding bareback in the Dakota fashion. As they rode away from the camp, Sarah glanced back once at the community that had sheltered her, however briefly. Women were dismantling lodges, children helping to pack belongings, elderly members directing the work with practiced authority. Despite the urgency of their evacuation, there was no panic. No chaos, just the efficient movement of a people accustomed to mobility and change. Their small party followed a narrow trail that wound through dense woodlands, moving at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting their mounts. The warriors remained vigilant, eyes constantly scanning the terrain, hands never far from weapons. Sarah rode beside Daniel, her body gradually adjusting to the rhythm of horseback travel. The Dakota had provided her with clothing better suited to the journey: buckskin leggings beneath her dress, a fringed leather jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat traded from settlers that would shield her fair skin from the sun. "How far is it to Fort Kearney?" she asked as they forded a shallow stream. 4 days of good travel, Daniel replied. Longer if we avoid main trails. Safer that way. Running Wolf, riding ahead, called something back in Dakota. Daniel tensed, his hand moving to his knife. What is it? Sarah asked, alarm rising. Fresh tracks crossing our path ahead, Daniel translated. Shod horses, not Dakota. The group halted as Running Wolf and Swift Elk dismounted to examine the trail. Their discussion was rapid and intense, punctuated by gestures toward the west. And south, 8 riders, Daniel explained quietly to Sarah. Passed this morning, heavy horses, deep prints, army patrol maybe? Or Jackson, Sarah finished, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. Stonehand rejoined them, speaking urgently to Daniel, who nodded grimly. Change of path, he told Sarah. Tracks head south toward the main trail. We go east first, then circle back. Adds 1 day to the journey, but safer. The extra day meant additional time for Jackson to prepare, to cover his tracks, perhaps even to launch another raid that would be blamed on the Dakota. But self-preservation had to take precedence. They could deliver no justice if they didn't. Reach Fort Kearny alive. As they altered course, heading into denser woodland that would shield them from distant observers, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on her shoulders. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness, a potential instrument of justice, perhaps even a bridge between 2 worlds locked in a cycle of suspicion and violence. The carved bear tucked safely in her pocket and Greyhawk's token secured in her medicine pouch, Sarah Mitchell, once a schoolteacher's daughter bound for Wyoming, now something altogether different, rode deeper into a future she could never have imagined, toward a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but perhaps the fate of peace on this contested frontier. 3 days of hard riding had brought them to within a day's journey of Fort Kearny. Their path had taken them through terrain few white settlers ever witnessed, hidden valleys where herds of buffalo still grazed undisturbed, ancient ceremonial grounds marked by standing stones, pristine lakes cupped in the hands of forested hills. Despite the beauty, the journey had been tense. Twice they had spotted distant riders and been forced to seek cover until the strangers passed. Once in the dark of night, they had frozen in place as a large contingent of mounted men, too many to count in the darkness, had passed less than half a mile from their hidden camp. Jackson gathers men, Running Wolf had observed grimly after the riders passed. Prepare something big. More reason to reach Bradford quickly, Daniel had replied, but Sarah had noted the concern in his eyes. Now, as they made camp on the evening of the 3rd day, the atmosphere among the small group was one of tightly controlled tension. They were close, tantalizingly close to their destination, but the final approach to the fort would be the most dangerous part of their journey. Tomorrow we separate, Daniel announced as they gathered around the small, carefully banked fire. Stonehand knows Bradford. He and Sarah approach the fort from east at dawn, show pass from Greyhawk, request a meeting with the mayor. And you? Sarah asked, not liking the direction of his plan. Rest of us watch from the hills. Make sure there is no trap. She wanted to object, to insist they stay together, but the logic was undeniable. A lone white woman with 1 elderly Dakota warrior might gain entrance to the fort. 5 armed Dakota men approaching with a white woman would likely meet a very different reception. What if Bradford isn't there? The possibility had troubled her thoughts throughout their journey. Or doesn't believe us? Stonehand has known Bradford for many seasons, Swift Elk said, his English better than Sarah had realized. Major is a fair man. We'll listen. As the others prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself studying the stars overhead, the same stars she had gazed at as a child in Ohio, the same stars that had guided the Dakota for countless generations. So much bloodshed beneath their steady light, so many misunderstandings and betrayals. Cannot sleep. Daniel's voice came quietly beside her. Sarah shook her head. Thinking about tomorrow, about what comes after. After, if we succeed, If Bradford believes us and arrests Jackson, what then? Where do I go? The question had been forming in her mind for days. I have no family left, no home. Daniel was silent for a long moment, his face half hidden in shadow. Many paths open before you. Could return east, start a new life. Could go west still, reach Wyoming. And if I wanted to stay? The words emerged before she had fully formed the thought. With the Dakota, I mean. With... She hesitated. With you. His eyes found hers in the darkness, searching. Hard path. Between worlds is a lonely place. I'm already between worlds, Sarah said softly. Have been since the day you found me. Daniel nodded slowly. True, but the choice must wait until after tomorrow. First, justice. First, justice, Sarah agreed, though her heart continued to ponder the question long after they had retired to their separate sleeping places. Dawn broke crisp and clear, the eastern sky painted in bands of gold and crimson. Sarah and Stonehand prepared to depart, securing minimal provisions for the final approach to the fort, which lay approximately 5 miles east over open prairie. Daniel handed Sarah a folded piece of rough paper, a crude but effective map. If there is trouble at the fort, follow this. Leads to a meeting place here. He indicated a spot along a river bend. We wait until sunset. If you do not come, we follow. Sarah nodded, tucking the map securely inside her jacket. The unspoken message was clear. If things went wrong, they would attempt a rescue, regardless of the risk. As she mounted her horse, Daniel approached, placing his hand briefly on her arm. Bear walks with you, he said quietly. And so do I, in spirit. The simple farewell carried more weight than any elaborate goodbye could have. Sarah covered his hand with hers for a moment, then turned her horse to follow Stonehand toward the rising sun. They had traveled less than 2 miles when Stonehand suddenly raised his hand in warning, pulling his horse to a stop behind a small copse of trees. Sarah followed suit, her heart racing as she heard what had alerted him, the unmistakable sound of many horses approaching from the south. Down, Stonehand hissed, sliding from his mount. Hide horses. They pulled their mounts deeper into the trees, tying them hurriedly before crawling to the edge of the small grove. From their vantage point, they could see a dust cloud moving rapidly along the main trail that paralleled their position, perhaps half a mile away. As the riders came into view, Sarah felt her blood run cold. There were at least 15 men, heavily armed, riding hard toward the fort. At their head was a figure she recognized instantly despite the distance. A tall man with red hair, wearing a black hat with a silver band. Jackson. They go to the fort, Stonehand whispered, his voice tight with tension. Why? The answer came to Sarah in a flash of horrible clarity. They know we're coming. The captured scout. He must have told them our plan before he was killed. They're going to reach the fort before us. Stonehand's weathered face grew grave. If Jackson speaks first to the army, tells lies. They'll be waiting for us, Sarah finished. We'd be riding into a trap. The old warrior considered for a moment, then gestured for her to follow him back to the horses. Must warn others. New plan is needed. They mounted quickly and rode back the way they had come, pushing their horses as fast as they dared through the rough terrain. When they reached the camp, Daniel and the others were already alert, having spotted their hasty return. Jackson, Sarah said before anyone could speak. 15 men heading for the fort. They must know we're coming. Daniel's expression darkened. Scout told them before death. My fault. Should have questioned more before council justice. No time for blame, Running Wolf cut in. Need new path now. They gathered around as Daniel sketched a rough map in the dirt with a stick. Fort here, Jackson approaches from the south. We are here. Could still reach Bradford, Stonehand suggested. Go north, circle wide, enter the fort from a different direction. Too slow, Swift Elk argued. Jackson will have hours to poison the army's mind against us. What if we don't go to the fort at all? Sarah interjected. All eyes turned to her. Bradford is army, must follow rules, gather evidence, process. She pointed to the map. But Jackson is here now, in the open, away from the fort. Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. You suggest we confront Jackson directly, 5 against 15? Not confront in battle, Sarah clarified. Intercept, capture, then bring him to Bradford. With the bandit leader himself as evidence, Bradford would have to listen. The warriors exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Dangerous, Daniel said finally. But it's possible. He pointed to a spot on his crude map. Trail passes through a narrow valley here. Good place for ambush. The plan came together quickly. They would ride ahead to the valley, position themselves on the ridges above. When Jackson and his men entered the narrow passage, they would spring their trap, not to kill, but to isolate Jackson from his men, and capture him alive. Woman stays back, Running Wolf insisted as they prepared to leave. Too dangerous. No, Sarah said firmly, checking the pistol she had carried since the bear attack. My testimony condemns him. I need to be there. Daniel studied her face for a moment, then nodded. She comes. Stay with me. They rode hard, taking a game trail that Swift Elk knew would bring them to the valley well ahead of Jackson's party. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached, steep ridges flanking a narrow passage where the trail was forced between towering rock walls. Perfect place for ambush, Wolf Runner observed as they surveyed the valley from above. No escape to the sides, must go forward or back. They positioned themselves strategically, Running Wolf and Swift Elk on the northern ridge, Stonehand and Wolf Runner on the southern. Daniel and Sarah took position at the eastern end of the valley, where the passage widened again. When Jackson reaches the center, Daniel explained as they crouched behind a fallen tree, others startle horses from above. Not attack, just frighten. Create confusion. In chaos we take Jackson. And if his men fight back, Sarah asked, the reality of what they were attempting beginning to sink in. Daniel's expression was grim. Then we fight too. But aim is capture, not kill. Justice needs a living witness. They didn't have long to wait. Less than an hour later, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the first riders came into view, entering the narrow passage from the west. Jackson rode third in line, his red hair visible beneath his distinctive hat. He was laughing at something one of his men said, utterly unaware of the trap about to be sprung. When the entire party had entered the valley, Daniel gave a signal, a bird call that echoed off the rock walls. Instantly, Running Wolf and Swift Elk began dislodging rocks from the ridge, sending them tumbling down behind the last riders, while Stonehand and Wolf Runner did the same ahead of the lead horses. The effect was instantaneous. Horses reared and bucked in panic as stones crashed down around them. Men shouted in confusion, some thrown from their mounts, others struggling to control terrified animals. In the chaos, Daniel and Sarah mounted and rode straight toward Jackson, who had managed to stay on his horse, but was separated from most of his men by the panicking animals between them. Jackson saw them coming and reacted with surprising speed, drawing his pistol and firing at Daniel. The shot went wide, but it alerted his men to the real threat. Several turned their attention from the falling rocks to the two riders charging toward their leader. "There!" one shouted. "It's the Indian and the girl!" Jackson's face contorted with rage and recognition. "Kill the redskin!" he bellowed. "The woman's mine!" Bullets whizzed past them as Daniel and Sarah closed the distance. From the ridges above, arrows rained down with precision, not killing but striking arms and legs, disabling without fatal wounds. In the melee, Sarah lost sight of Daniel. Her horse pushed forward through the chaos, bringing her face to face with Jackson himself, his pistol leveled at her chest, his eyes wild with hatred. "Should have made sure you were dead at the wagons, girl," he snarled. Before he could pull the trigger, Sarah's own pistol was in her hand, the lesson of the bear fresh in her mind. She fired without hesitation. Jackson jerked backward, his shoulder blossoming red where her bullet struck. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as he lost his grip, sliding sideways from his saddle. Sarah's horse reared as gunfire continued around them. She clung to its mane, struggling to stay mounted amid the chaos. When she regained control, she saw Daniel on foot, locked in hand-to-hand combat with Jackson, who, despite his wounded shoulder, fought with desperate strength. The other warriors had descended from the ridges and were engaged with Jackson's men, the battle spreading across the valley floor. It was impossible to tell who was winning in the swirling dust and confusion. Sarah dismounted, searching for a way to help Daniel. Jackson had drawn a knife and was slashing wildly, forcing Daniel to dodge and weave to avoid the blade. Blood streaked Daniel's arm, where he'd already been caught once. Without conscious thought, Sarah picked up a fallen branch, heavy as a club, and circled behind the fighting men. When Jackson lunged forward again, she swung with all her strength, connecting solidly with the back of his head. The bandit leader crumpled instantly, falling face first into the dirt. Daniel looked up, momentarily stunned, then gave Sarah a grim nod of thanks before quickly binding Jackson's hands behind his back. Around them, the battle was subsiding. Several of Jackson's men were down, wounded but alive. Others had fled, escaping back the way they had come. The Dakota warriors had suffered injuries as well. Stone Hand clutched a bloodied arm, and Swift Elk limped badly, but all were standing. "We have him," Daniel said, hauling the unconscious Jackson upright. "Now we go to the fort with proof." They bound the captured bandits to their horses and set off toward Fort Kearney, their strange procession moving at a careful pace to accommodate the wounded. Sarah rode beside Daniel, who led Jackson's horse with the semi-conscious bandit, tied securely to the saddle. "You fought well," Daniel said quietly as the fort appeared on the horizon. "Bear spirit is strong in you." Sarah glanced at him, seeing, beyond the calm exterior, to the pride and something else in his eyes. "I had a good teacher. The fort's sentries spotted them long before they reached the gates. A warning bugle sounded, and they could see soldiers rushing to defensive positions along the walls. "Slow now," Daniel cautioned. "No sudden moves." When they were within hailing distance, Sarah rode forward alone, her hands visible and empty. "I am Sarah Mitchell," she called up to the wary faces on the wall. "Survivor of the Westbrook Massacre. We have captured Franklin Jackson, the man responsible. We seek justice from Major Bradford." There was a moment of confused consultation among the soldiers before the gates opened and a contingent rode out to meet them. At their head was a tall, stern-faced officer with silver at his temples. "I am Major William Bradford," he announced, his gaze moving from Sarah to the bound prisoners, then to the wounded Dakota warriors. "This is most irregular." Sarah reached into her jacket and produced Greyhawk's token. "Chief Greyhawk sends greetings. He says you know his mark and that you are a man who listens to the truth, no matter who speaks it." Bradford took the token, examining it carefully before tucking it into his pocket. "I know Greyhawk, a man of honor." His eyes narrowed as he studied Jackson's bloody, defiant face. "And I know of Franklin Jackson. His reputation is considerably less honorable." "He led the attack on our wagon train," Sarah said firmly. "Murdered 18 settlers, including my father, then blamed it on the Dakota to cover his crimes. He's been raiding both settlers and native hunting parties, deliberately inciting conflict between our peoples." "Lies!" Jackson spat, struggling against his bonds. "This woman's been turned by savages. Can't believe a word." "Be silent," Bradford cut him off sharply. He turned back to Sarah. "Do you have evidence of these claims, beyond your word?" "I witnessed the massacre personally," Sarah replied. "And these men," she gestured to the Dakota warriors, "can testify to attacks on their people that were blamed on settlers. Jackson's other men, those who escaped, can be captured and questioned. The truth will come out." Bradford considered this for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Bring the prisoners inside. We'll get statements from everyone. If what you say is true, Miss Mitchell, justice will be served." He glanced at the Dakota warriors. "All of you are welcome inside the fort, under my personal protection." As they passed through the gates of Fort Kearny, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The journey wasn't over. There would be questions, testimonies, legal proceedings. But Jackson was captured. The truth would be heard, and for the first time since the massacre, justice seemed possible. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood on the crest of a hill overlooking the prairie, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Fort Kearny lay behind her, its walls now a place of safety rather than uncertainty. Bradford had been true to his word. Jackson and his captured men had been thoroughly questioned, their contradicting stories unraveling under the major's skilled interrogation. Evidence had been gathered, witnesses called, and justice set in motion. Jackson would hang for his crimes, his surviving men sentenced to long years in territorial prison. More importantly, Bradford had sent official dispatches to Army Command, clearing the Dakota of blame for the raids and recommending renewed peace talks with Greyhawk and other chiefs. It wasn't a perfect solution to the complex problems of the frontier, but it was a step toward truth, toward understanding. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Sarah turned to see Daniel approaching. He looked different in the fading light, less guarded, perhaps, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Bradford says official papers are ready," he said as he reached her side. "Your testimony is written, signed, justice done." "As much as it can be," Sarah replied softly. The dead wouldn't return, the pain wouldn't vanish, but something had been accomplished, something important. "You decide?" Daniel asked after a moment of silence. "What path do you take now?" Bradford had offered to arrange passage east for her, a return to civilization, to what remained of her old life. There were distant cousins in Boston who might take her in, a chance to rebuild something familiar. Sarah's hand went to her pocket, where the carved bear still resided. "I have." She turned to face Daniel fully. "The way I see it, there are two kinds of people in this world, those who build walls and those who build bridges. My father taught for 30 years, trying to build bridges through education. The least I can do is continue that work in my own way." Daniel's expression remained careful, neutral. "Meaning, Bradford has offered me a position here, as a translator and cultural liaison between the fort and the Dakota. He says someone who understands both worlds is valuable." She studied Daniel's face, looking for his reaction. "I would live here, but travel regularly to the Dakota camps, learn more of your language, your ways, help prevent misunderstandings like the ones Jackson exploited." Slowly, the careful mask slipped from Daniel's features, revealing a quiet joy that reached his eyes. "Bridge builder," he said thoughtfully. "Good path, hard path." "Most worthwhile things are," Sarah replied, "and I wouldn't be walking it alone. Bradford has asked you to serve as a scout and liaison as well, if you're willing." Daniel looked out over the prairie, toward the distant hills where his people's summer camp would now be established. "My father was a scout, tried to build a bridge, failed." His eyes found hers again. "Maybe his son does better, with the right partner." Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest, like the first tentative bloom of spring after a harsh winter. Partners, then, as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her a new purpose, Sarah Mitchell, survivor, witness, bridge builder, stood beside Daniel's swift river and faced the future together. The carved bear rested between them, a symbol of the path they had traveled and the one that stretched before them, a path that would never be easy but would always be true. The lone survivor of a wagon train massacre, and the Dakota hunter who had found her when she had nothing left but the will to survive, had discovered something unexpected amid the shadows on the prairie, a shared destiny, a common purpose, and the courage to walk between worlds. As the sun sets on Sarah and Daniel's story, remember that the most powerful bridges are often built by those who have known both shores. In a time of division and misunderstanding, the frontier forged unlikely allies who chose to seek truth over comfortable lies, justice over vengeance, and connection over isolation. For in the end, it is not our differences that define us, but the courage to see beyond them, to recognize the humanity in those we've been taught to fear, and to find strength in the very wilderness that once threatened to consume us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.